A Heroine's Beginning. Chapter 5. I have spoken before of the happiness of Miss Ella and her family. I am sorry to tell you, but that happiness did not last very long. The beginning of the end of this contentment began after I had worked for the manor for a year. I was now 15, and Miss Ella was 16. Jane was now formally betrothed to Michael, and the wedding was to take place as soon as he could afford a house of their own. We were all very excited about this news, and it would frequently occupy most of our conversations. The arrangements to be made, what sort of flowers Jane would weave into her hair, and the dances that would be enjoyed at the wedding celebration. Jane and I would stay up late into the night discussing these details in great length. Our lives otherwise continued as normal. We would rise, work all day, and then sleep. We served a wonderful family, and were very content with our situation. Miss Ella would still visit the kitchens often, and I was beginning to teach her how to adjust clothes, as her embroidery was already very good. One night, while the family was at dinner, Jane and I sat by the fire in the kitchen, drinking a cup of tea. Suddenly the bell rang twice, indicating 2 servants were required to attend. Mrs. Taylor was in the pantry, restocking the shelves and counting the amount of food remaining. Mrs. Pole was in her private study, no doubt settling accounts or designating different tasks for the following few days amongst the 4 of us. Jane stood up. She was the one who normally attended this sort of thing. "Come on, then," she said to me. "Why me? I do not serve them at dinner," I replied. "Well, they rang for 2 of us, so someone has to go," she reasoned with me, and half pulled me out of my chair, laughing a little at my reluctance to go. We made our way through the back corridor to the dining room, where the family stood around Lady Eleanor, whose face was the color of snow. Sir Henry looked up at us. "Marion, please clear the plates. And Jane, would you accompany Eleanor upstairs to bed, please?" His face was lined with worry for his wife, even though she kept insisting she was fine, just a little dizzy and tired. Jane snaked her arm around the mistress, while I began to pile plates up in my arms. When I was about finished, Jane and Lady Eleanor had gotten to the doorway, when she was suddenly wrecked with a coughing fit. She moved her sleeve in front of her mouth to cover it, but when the fit had subsided, she lowered her arm. Everyone could see the bloodstains against the light blue of her dress. Sir Henry stood up immediately and shouted to her, but Lady Eleanor had already begun to faint. Luckily, Jane caught her. Sir Henry raced across the room and gathered up his unconscious wife into his arms. "Get a physician, now!" he shouted. I dropped the plates onto the table and ran out of the room. I ran through the kitchen, stopping only to pick up my cloak, to warm me as I ran into the night. The local physician lived in the village, though fortunately on the closest side of the village to the manor. When I arrived, I could see there was a candle burning in his window, and I sped toward it. By the time I reached the door, I was out of breath. My lungs hurt. There was a severe pain on my side, and my eyes were watering. I pounded on the door as hard as I could. Those moments I waited seemed like hours, until eventually the door opened, and Mr. Smith stood before me, looking a little annoyed at the lateness of the hour. "Sorry to disturb you, sir," I began, "but it's the mistress, Lady Eleanor. She's been taken ill, and she's been coughing up blood and fainting." Mr. Smith didn't say a word, but walked back into the house and began packing his medical bag, retrieving his cloak. He swiftly blew out the candle that was burning, plunging the house into darkness, and walked purposefully toward me. "How long ago was this?" he inquired, as we made our way back up the path to the manor. "About 15 minutes ago, sir," I told him. "And has she ever displayed these symptoms before?" "Not that I know of." "And no one else in the house is ill?" "I don't think so, sir." He fell quiet, as if pondering this new information. I knew a little of Mr. Smith. He had visited my mother a few times when she was in her weakened state, and I knew him to be a man of few words. He liked to keep things plain and straight to the point. He didn't have much use for beating around the bush. We walked the rest of the way to the manor in silence, my mind racing and praying that Lady Eleanor would be all right. When we arrived, I showed him straight up to the master's room. Inside, there was a sorry sight. Lady Eleanor was laid on the bed, and her complexion was deathly white. Blood was lining her lips, and a slight trickle of it was making its way down her face from her nose. Ella was holding tightly to her hand, kneeling at one side of the bed, her cheeks stained with tears. Sir Henry was pacing the space between the bed and the window, and he looked like he had been doing it for some time. Mr. Smith instantly walked to his patient to examine her, and I went to stand with Jane, who was near the door looking worried. "How bad is it?" I asked her. "She's been coughing ever since downstairs. She came around, but I think she's in a great amount of pain," Jane said, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. "Would you mind staying here? I'm going to go tell Mrs. Pole what's happening. I think one of us should stay here in case they need anything." I nodded without looking at her, my thoughts too caught up in the sight before me. Jane left, sniffling as she went. Mr. Smith seemed to conclude his examination and walked over to where Sir Henry was pacing. They spoke quietly, but the master's face gave away the meaning of the conversation. Lady Eleanor was not going to survive. When they stopped talking, Mr. Smith walked out of the room. Sir Henry went over to the bed and laid down upon it, picking his wife up in his arms to hold her. Her chest rose and fell so little, it was almost as though she wasn't breathing. Ella still held her mother's hand tightly in hers, more tears falling down her face, when she looked upon her father. He was broken, his eyes never leaving his wife's form as he addressed me. "Would you please give us a moment alone?" I did not reply. I simply walked out of the room, my heart full of sorrow. She was only my mistress, not family, and even I was affected by her pain. I closed the door behind me to give them some privacy, but I did not go. I sat on the floor in the hallway, just in case they needed something. My own eyes were starting to tear up now. It seemed massively unfair. She was a good and kind lady, and did not deserve to suffer like this. She was not an old woman who had had her time on this earth. She still had so much time left. While I sat there, Mrs. Pole came running up the hallway, but stopped when she saw me. Her graying hair was falling out of its bun even more than usual, her face white with panic. I told her in a quiet voice that they had requested to be in private, and should not be disturbed. She nodded, and came over to sit next to me. We sat there together, not speaking for what seemed like an age, just waiting. We dreaded what would happen when the silence broke. I'm not entirely sure how long it was, but when the silence did break, it was a terrible moan. We didn't have to open the door to know it was Miss Ella. The sound was followed by a loud sobbing, and it wasn't isolated. There were two voices crying out in unison, joined in their pain. We didn't look inside, or ask. We already knew.